Well, hey, and welcome to Ministry Hangouts with Pastor Greg Surratt. And it is great to have all of you here and joining us maybe through the archive, or maybe you're listening right now on a podcast and kind of joining in just on audio. And if you're doing that, you wouldn't be able to see something. You wouldn't be able to see how much Pastor Greg has aged today, because today is his birthday. And so on this Ministry Hangout today, we're actually celebrating the host birthday. So Pastor Greg, you want to say anything about that, and just tell us what's going on with Ministry Hangout?
Thanks for pointing that out, Shawn. I appreciate that. And I was just kind of looking at myself on the screen, which is kind of intimidating, and it looks like that the hairline has gone back a little bit, and there's bags on the eyes that probably I need an eye job too. But maybe we'll save that for the next birthday. And I thought it would be great on my birthday. Let's talk about mental health. How's that? So I'm looking forward to it. We're going to have a great time together. It's Ministry Hangouts. I appreciate all of you being a part. And like Shawn said, we archive all of this, and it's a great tool for your staff. You may want to sit down and watch one of these and just kind of discuss a little bit. But I am excited about today. We're on a topic that really is getting a lot of traction in the church, and that used to be kind of taboo, but now there are more and more people talking about it. And so we're going to talk about really how to stay sane and lead people, how to deal with when you are having challenges emotionally, mentally, and also hopefully touch just a little bit on how we handle this in the church. And so, Shawn, why don't you introduce us to our guests, and we'll kick in.
Absolutely. Well, we've got some great guests today. First is Dr. Tim Jennings, who has got a national ministry of helping people through burnout, through depression. He actually will, I'll tell you a little bit about himself in a moment, but Pastor Greg, helps you retrain your mind. I don't think he can make hair grow up there, but he can work on what's inside, so that's why we're glad to have him there today. Dr. Jennings, tell us a little bit about yourself and just your ministry and what you do.
Hi, thank you. I am a Christian psychiatrist, physician who helps focus on the diseases of the brain and the mind. I am the current president of the Tennessee Psychiatric Association and president-elect of the Southern Psychiatric Association, and I also have a not-for-profit ministry, ComeAndReason.com, which we really try to produce materials that can help Christians have a healthier mind.
I sat down and had dinner with you just a few weeks ago here in Charleston, and was fascinated by the conversation, and I think it's your latest book, which we'll talk about just a little bit as we go on.
Thank you.
Great. And then also we have an alum to our Ministry Hangouts, Carey Nieuwhof, and pastor the church up in Canada, and does a great job with his blog and writing, and also just being honest and transparent about some struggles with burnout that he had in his ministry career. So, Carey, it was great to have you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your church, and just what brings you here.
Yeah, great to be back. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Shawn. I lead a great church called Connexus Church, north of Toronto, Canada. We have a couple of locations. We're about 7 years old, and we're a North Point strategic partner. I also work alongside the great folks at Orange and help people really reach families. And as you mentioned, one of my hobbies is to blog, and recently I launched a podcast. So really enjoying that. And I'm married, and I have two grown sons, 23 and 19, and my 23-year-old is married, so I also have a wonderful daughter-in-law.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on the call as well. Also want to let those of you who are watching know that we will take your questions, the live audience here, and you can just hashtag those on Twitter with Ministry Hangout. And we'll be following that on Twitter, and would love to ask your questions as well as the ones that we are bringing to the table as we just have an honest discussion about mental health and the church today. So I'll throw it back over to you, Pastor Greg, to lead us through this discussion.
Well, let's start with one of the occupational, I like to say one of the occupational hazards of leadership or being a pastor is discouragement. And it's going to happen. You just have to learn how are we going to handle this? How are we going to deal with it? And it's a subject, burnout and stress, depression, mental illness haven't always been subjects that the church has been willing to discuss or engage in discussions. Why do you think, either one of you, why do you think that is? Why do you think it's kind of been a taboo discussion in the church in past times?
Well,
Carey,
I'll jump in if you want me to. I was kind of waiting for the pastor to jump in.
I was trying to be polite. You know, I'm Canadian. What can I say?
Okay. Well, you know, I think it has to do with the idea that there was a split historically between mental health treatments, psychiatry, psychology, and religious belief back at the founding of modern psychiatry with Freud and stuff. And I think that the churches in a great degree kind of got off-put towards modern mental health treatment because they became fearful that modern mental health treatment would take people away from a belief in God, and there was kind of a split there. And then some people see mental health conditions as a moral weakness rather than a physical illness, and that I think was a contributing factor.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I would agree. I think that's very well said. There's always been a split, at least in the church that I grew up in. But I think there's another reason as well, at least there was for me personally, which is that I didn't want to, if that stigma. And I knew at times, there's a stigma attached to mental health, there's a stigma attached to burnout, or even honestly discouragement in the church if you're in a season of discouragement or you're not feeling great. And as a leader, I really had to overcome my pride to admit that I was struggling. And as we said before we started the Hangout, I just actually preached on Sunday at our church and sort of told the fullest version of the story I've told. I've talked to leaders about it, to our church a little bit, but in 2006 I really burned out. And it got me to a point, and this was the hardest part to talk about, where I actually thought that not living was a better option than living for a short season. And man, to say that on Sunday, I spent Monday just kind of wrung out after that, but to kind of complete clean. But I'm so glad we're starting the conversation, and Perry Noble's been a huge encouragement in this. He's helped us with this series and been very transparent about his life. But the guys I've heard from since I preached on Sunday who have said, yeah, I've been there, or one guy said, I almost died 3 years ago and I just forgot the code to my garage and ended up not being able to close the door. Other guys struggling with like anxiety and panic attacks. So I think for me, honestly, it was just pride. I mean, we make other people well, but we don't have any problems. So not comfortable.
Carey, what was the process for you? As you look back, like, it's bright and sunny one day, and the next day you're not sure life's worth living. Was it like that, or was there a process? What were the triggers?
Yeah, it fell off the cliff pretty quick, Greg. It happened in a period of about 3 weeks. So I'm an A-type driven person, and when I burned out, it was 2006. I had just turned 41, and I had been told all through my 30s that I was going to burn out. I mean, I'm a driven guy. I love to see the church grow. I love to take on big projects and challenges. And I was always able to pull myself back from burnout. I was always able just to, come right to the edge and then, okay, get some sleep, take a break, and you're fine. And ironically, things were going fairly well. Like at the beginning of 2006, I had just come back from speaking at North Point Church for the first time, and I mean that was a real high. I mean, in terms of ministry, spoke to 2,500 church leaders. My wife called it the talk of my life to that point, and everything was going great. And within 3 weeks, I felt horrible. Like the plane landed, and our church was growing, and things were going well, and I felt like I fell off a cliff, and I didn't know how to get back. So it was very, very sudden. And that period of really what I think, I didn't get a clinical diagnosis, but my wife has a medical background. I mean, I'm sure it was depression. I was probably depressed for about at least 6 months. And, in the worst moments, really thought that death was a better alternative, or at least maybe not better, but was an alternative to, or maybe the only logical way out. And it got really dark. And if I had to label it now, I'm not even sure exactly what to call it. I would probably call it emotional burnout coupled with physical burnout that led to a depression. And I'd been seeing a counselor for a while, and he was dealing with some character issues inside of me that honestly just needed to be dealt with. And I mean, that's a hard journey to begin, but it was kind of like a perfect storm, and it all came together and left me in a very low place.
Hmm. I when I first started into pastoral ministry, we went to pastor a small church in northern Illinois, out in the farming community, and it was a major change. My wife and I grew up in Denver, Colorado, and now we're in a small town, lots of snow, and I was all excited about being a pastor. That's all I want to do. I want to be a part of creating a different kind of church, reach people for God. And we were there probably 3 or 4 weeks, and I fell into a very deep, dark depression. And I'd never been depressed in my life. I was always the kind of guy that, I depressed other people. I caused depression. I didn't have depression. And for me, it went on for about 6 months, and it was the type of thing where I'd go to bed, couldn't sleep while I was in bed, but couldn't get out of bed, and basically would get up for the weekend to do whatever I needed to do. And Wednesday night, avoided people, and cried a lot, and wanted to quit, and I didn't know what to do. That was a number of years ago, and you certainly didn't admit to anything like that. And I tried to hide it the best I could, and I didn't know who to talk to. I had no idea. Probably the saving grace for me was a very patient, very even, very level wife who helped me through, and then my father, a very positive guy, who would just speak the word, into my spirit. And ultimately, for me, it was just studying Philippians chapter 4, especially, and also somehow I got a hold of a book by a Christian, I don't know if it's a psychiatrist or psychologist, called "Telling Yourself the Truth," and that was very, very helpful to me. And but what it has done over the years has made me much more sympathetic with those who struggle in these types of areas. Carey, for you, do you think it's just a byproduct of the job, or are there steps that we can take as pastors to live healthier or avoid burnout? I don't know if mine was burnout. I mean, I'm just getting started.
You just started. You were barely out of the gate, right?
I was just out of the gate, yeah. So I really, even to this day, I don't know what the triggers were, but how would you address that?
Yeah, I think for sure there were definitely some patterns in my life that were not very healthy. I talk about it frequently now, but I wasn't taking a Sabbath, and now I think the Scripture's right. If you don't take the Sabbath will take you. And the land is going to get its rest, whether you want it to or not. And so I slept pretty much for the month of August of 2006. Like, I think it was for sure some physical burnout. Like when you're done a Sunday morning and you preached, you're kind of like, and you have a good nap and you have a good sleep that night. Well, that was like a decade of built up fatigue, I think, and there was definitely some emotional fatigue, and I wasn't very good at grieving losses, and for me, if someone left the church, it's like, oh, that's no big deal, or if something didn't go my way, oh, that's no big deal. And yet you study the Scripture and other cultures, and you see, when Moses died, people were in mourning for 40 days, and I read that for years going, gosh, was he that loved? Like, can't you just get on with it in about a day? And I had a counselor speak into my life who just said, you need to grieve your losses. And I think I spent, you mentioned crying a lot. I spent that summer in a lot of tears. Like, I'd never cried so much in my life. And I probably didn't cry a lot in my 30s, and I think I made up for it that summer. But once I got rest taken care of, and once I had grieved some of the issues in my life, and God continued to drill down on my character, things that were impacting my marriage, things that were impacting my leadership. And I mean, there was no scandal, there was no affair, there was no addiction. It was just really sanctification issues. It was like, Carey, this is who you are naturally, and I'm reforming you, I'm remaking you, I'm turning you into a new creation, and things that needed to be done in my character that needed to be chiseled away. And so I think the other way to look at it, Greg, is now, 9 years later, almost 9 years later, 8.5 years later, I have to really, really watch my balance in life, and I have to pay much closer attention to my rhythm, to my pace. I'm still very driven. I still do an awful lot of things, and I like to overreach a little bit, but I really have to know when to pull back. And I would say probably the biggest thing for me has just been self-awareness. Self-awareness spiritually, how are God and I doing? Self-awareness in terms of when I need time off. Self-awareness in terms of my impact on other people and my actions and my attitude and the impact of those on other people. And self-awareness just in terms of self-care, which I was really not very good at. I just kept thinking I could run through a brick wall, and one day I hit it.
Dr. Jennings, you do a series of lectures on the healing power of the brain, which is a fascinating concept. How can we cooperate with God in the healing process, and what does it look like in your office or practice? And also, if you want to speak into anything that Carey and I talked about there, if you could help fix me, that would be a help tremendously. I don't know if it'll help anybody else, but. Yeah.
No, I really appreciate what both of you guys have said. I want the listening audience to know that when it comes to depression, any human being can experience depression. It's just a matter of whether you hit them with the right contributing factors or not. And when somebody is depressed, it's actually a physiological condition of both brain and body in which you generally have increased inflammatory cascades going on in the body that alter the brain circuitry, the part of the brain where you reason and think, called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex behind your forehead, is underactive when people are depressed, so it's harder to problem solve. You're more overwhelmed quickly. Normal problems seem like giant problems. The part of the brain above the orbit of your eye where you get a conviction of wrongdoing when you're depressed is overactive. So people who are depressed have this conviction of inadequacy, that nothing they do is good enough. The part of the brain behind the bridge of your nose, about an inch or so back, is called the anterior cingulate cortex. It's where you experience empathy and connectedness with other people and the seat of the will, where you make decisions. And when people are depressed, it's underactive, so people will feel emotionally disconnected and ambivalent. They have a hard time making choices. And then the fear circuitry, your amygdala, is overactive in depression, so you get the sense of apprehension and dread. Even if you can't point out anything that's really troubling, you just feel it's on edge all the time. And then your pleasure circuitry, your nucleus accumbens, is unreactive, so you have this experience that even when positive things go, you get no joy out of it. And this is what's happening in somebody's brain when they're depressed. So when people come to see me in my office and they're depressed, I first want to do an assessment and diagnose that, okay, this is depression, but just diagnosing them still doesn't, because there's a myriad of contributing factors that can lead a person to depression. And so then you want to go down, what are the contributing factors to depression? And they go through different types of categories. One of the things we want to do, and what I appreciate you guys saying, you both mentioned, I wasn't doing some things that I could have been that were healthy for me, or I was doing some things that weren't as healthy for me. And that's a great idea, because when we do unhealthy things, we undermine our resilience, which makes us more vulnerable to the burnout that leads into depression. And so things that are actually very resilient or antidepressant that are natural for us is nutrition, a healthy diet, and particularly an anti-inflammatory diet, which would be a vegetarian and or Mediterranean diets have been shown to give brain resilience. You have less risk of dementia, less risk of depression than the typical American junk food, fast food diet. And in fact, there's been a study that shows that people who eat junk food, fast food have a 60% higher rate of depression than people who don't, because their inflammatory foods and inflammation kicks on this process. So getting the proper...
Hang on a second. Before you go further, let's get that number again. What did you just say about our American diet? What's the percentage higher?
It's a dose-dependent. It's a dose-dependent thing of things like pizza, croissants, donuts, candies, cookies. this type of stuff, burgers. The fast food diet results in a 60% higher rate of depression than people who don't eat a fast food diet, but it is dose dependent.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Wow.
Meaning if you eat a little, it gives you a little risk. If you eat a lot, you get a higher risk. Okay, because the common pathway is inflammation. So that's one thing we want to do. Another thing that's important is sleep. Sleep disorders and sleep deprivation, and this is a lot of Americans don't know this, but the majority of Americans are sleep deprived. And sleep is one of the 4 physical requirements for life: air, water, food, and sleep. And if you sleep deprived, then you actually increase inflammation. Not only that, you increase the risk of dementia as you age. So you have to evaluate sleep. A lot of people, when they get sleep deprived, then they feel fatigued, they're sluggish, they're not doing as well, and so they hit themselves with stimulants. So that's with caffeine and other types of things to try to pick themselves up because they're not getting the amount of sleep. And then that is actually an inflammatory factor, and you can get a cycle going, and that can increase your risk. So you want to get people good sleep. I love what you said about Sabbath rest. I can't tell you to my patients, and I ask them, are you getting 1 day in 7 to rest your mind? Your body gets rest, it's sleep. But your mind needs to unwind and connect and celebrate with God and family, where you aren't doing the laundry, you aren't cleaning the house, you aren't doing the shopping, you aren't taking care of your homework, whatever it is you're doing, that you put all that aside 1 day in 7 and let your mind unwind and rest. And this is very restorative. I'm going to tell you, most Christians that I deal with do not do this. They might take 4 hours on Sunday morning, but they don't do this on a 24-hour basis, where they just allow themselves to decompress with the Lord and with family. So this is helpful. Other things that we look at, you mentioned breathing. This is absolutely true too. When people have losses of any kind that they don't resolve them, then in the mind what happens in the brain circuitry is it actually kicks up your stress circuits. Stress circuits increase inflammation in your body. And that contributes then ultimately reacting back on the brain, contributing to depression. So we want to look at that. We look at specifically at pastors and the people in the pastoral ministry. They tend to be caring people. And they, in my experience working with them, is they have difficult time saying no. They have a difficult time setting boundaries. And thus they will often take more on themselves than they legitimately ought to be taking on themselves. And they have to remember they're finite. They have limited abilities. And it's not just actual scheduled stuff like how many committees, how many meetings, how many sermons, it's also people come to them with problems. And a lot of times they'll take on the emotional weight of other people, and they'll worry for other people. They'll grieve for other people. They'll feel the emotional stress that isn't even theirs to feel, not just in an empathic way, in a supportive way, but in a what can I do to fix it kind of way, which puts additional stress on them. Learning how to set boundaries where you can be there as a resource, but ultimately you can't fix a lot of other people's problems, and allow those people to work their own problems through with the encouragement and support you can provide, but not taking on the burden for yourself.
That's really helpful.
That is a bunch. I'd love to unpack some of that.
I'm acting it out, but I'm going to pause right there.
Yeah. Well, listen. Don't feel like you have to. That is some incredible stuff. Now, Carey mentioned there were a couple of things. Sabbath. What, in your mind, what would an ideal Sabbath look like, Dr. Jennings? What could I do to do the best to really restore my mind on a Sabbath?
Yeah, I think celebrating with the Lord, turning off the TV, turning off the football games, use your DVR and watch them afterwards. Turn off the shopping and the laundry and the housekeeping, and decompress with family. Go out into nature. Go for a picnic somewhere. Obviously, going to church. Having a group of people over, maybe for a Bible study and a prayer group. These types of activities can be very restorative, where you're actually turning your attention away from your problems, away from yourself, onto your higher power, and communing in that relationship for 24 hours a week.
Now, Carey talked about people leaving the church, and you going, "Oh, it's not a big deal." Carey, did you honestly feel like it wasn't a big deal, or was that just kind of a coping mechanism?
I think I could convince myself it wasn't a big deal. There is a tendency for me, and it's interesting you say a lot of the people attracted to ministry are naturally compassionate people. I'm not. I mean, compassion is a skill for me, but I honestly had convinced myself that it wasn't a big deal. You know, if someone left or something went bad or we didn't hit this or we didn't hit that, it wasn't a big deal. But I learned after I was burning out that it actually was a big deal. And just because my head told me it shouldn't be a big deal, my heart told me otherwise. And it was like, just in the same way that I had accumulated sleep deficit, I think I also had accumulated grief. And that there's wisdom in actually taking some time to grieve your losses before God, and even with friends or people close to you. And now what I do is, like, if something is bothering me, I pray about it. I might process it with someone. If it's really bad, I'll go back to a counselor again to work it through. But I try not to carry hurt forward. I try to make sure that's grieved in the season in which it happens, and then if it comes back, you know, you grieve it again. And it's actually not, it's probably less dramatic than it sounds, because most of the time there's no tears. It's just like, yeah, that one hurt, ow. And you kind of talk to God about it, and maybe you talk to one or two people about it, and then you go, okay, it doesn't hurt as much anymore, and you move on. And I think part of that is just keeping my mind and my heart in step with reality. Whereas, you know, when you read about Steve Jobs, he had, what do they call it, the reality vortex or something like that, the distortion reality field.
Distortion reality field, yeah.
Distortion reality field. I had a pretty good one going on. And I could, you know, reality is what you make it, which to some extent is true and healthy. I mean, we become self-fulfilling prophecies, right? You think everything's terrible, eventually it will be. You think everything's great, and it'll probably go better for you. But I think my reality distortion field was perhaps a little bit dissolved from reality.
Well, I know personally, and from talking to just hundreds of pastors, that that issue is a tough one when people leave. You know. Then there are a lot of reasons people leave. Some of them good, some of them selfish, some of them, you know, whatever. Regardless of what it is, there's a deep thing that goes on inside. Dr. Jennings, what would you, if you were talking to a pastor who is dealing with that issue, because a lot of them do, how do you handle that? What's a healthy way of processing? You know, when someone leaves.
We're talking about like membership of the church.
Yeah, a lot of times, most times it's people on the fringes of relationship, but sometimes, and I know these are the most devastating ones, when you'll have a pastor say, you know, they were our best friends, or you know, my wife was so close to them, and something happened and they left. What do you say to a pastor in a situation like that?
Yeah, what I say is that we have to come back and remember what we're responsible for and what we're not responsible for. We're responsible, through God's grace, for being the healthiest person we can be in governance of ourselves. Living up to the responsibilities, loving others. If we look at Jesus Christ as an example, he did everything perfectly, and Judas still betrayed him. It was hurtful to him, but there's a difference between grief and guilt, grief and self-blame, grief and self-criticism, which we tend to fall into when we lose something we don't like. And we're grieving, there's this tendency to then turn it back on ourselves and start questioning, well, if I'd have done this different, if I'd have done that different, maybe I should have done this, maybe I should have done that. And it leads to these negative ruminating loops that can be quite distressing to people. And instead, it's healthier to come back and say, wait a minute, first off, I'm responsible for dealing with myself in the healthiest way I can, and then understanding, which I think is very helpful, some of God's design protocols for relationships. And one of those is what I describe in my books as the law of liberty, and that love only grows in an atmosphere of freedom. And if we love other people, we present the truth in love and leave people fulfilled. And sometimes people have a journey they need to take that takes them away from us for a while. The prodigal son had to run away from home for a while before he figured it out and grew up and came back home, and he was a loyal and dedicated son, much more so than the older son who never left home.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes people have that journey, and granting them the freedom to take a path that we don't necessarily understand for them, and surrendering them into the Lord's hands sometimes is a very mature thing to do, as long as we can look in the mirror and say, you know what, Lord, my conscience is clear. There's nothing more I could have done with the resources I had, and I'm at peace. I'm surrendering that to your hands.
Okay, good. I know that counseling is one of the ways, Carey, you're talking about you have spoken with a counselor, maybe still speak with a counselor. I fortunately have one on staff, Chip Judd, who has been on with me, and I joke that the reason he's on staff is so that the church pays for my counseling. But and it's great to have somebody that you can like open up to, pour it out. Hey, I know this isn't what I should be thinking, but it is what I am thinking, and help me with that. How can we direct people, Dr. Jennings especially, who maybe is not in your area, to find somebody to help them that would line up with a biblical form of counseling that you practice, that you suggest? How do you find that?
That's actually a question I get all over the world when I speak. People ask this question all the time. And what I recommend for them to do is start with their local pastor or church leadership and ask them if they already know and have established in their community providers that have got a reputation through experience of being not only biblically sound but clinically sound, because they're not always equal. You can have somebody who's neurobiologically sound, but maybe is not a believer. You can have somebody who's a believer, but isn't clinically necessarily sound. You want really somebody who's gotten both. And so you ask your local church leadership if they've already identified those people in your community. You can also ask your physician if he knows people in the community that do this, and then you can go to various resources like the American Association of Christian Counselors, the Christian Medical Dental Association. They actually have membership lists that you can explore, and then when you get that membership list, then you look in your community, and then you take those names and then run some of those names by people and see what kind of reputation they have in the community. And then finally, what I recommend people do when you go to a counselor and you're being evaluated, that first visit or two, you also should be evaluating the person who's evaluating you to determine whether they have a similar life philosophy and you feel comfortable working with them or not. And it's perfectly okay after one or two visits for you to conclude, I'm not comfortable with this person, I'm going to find somebody else.
Okay. What about medicine? What role does it have in all of this? Carey, you talked about your process. Was there a lot of medicine involved? How was that with you? And then I want to get the doctor to weigh in just a little bit.
Yeah, there wasn't in my case, because it didn't last quite long enough. I'm a guy, I should have gone to the doctor earlier, and I didn't. But, he might have prescribed something, and I have very good friends who have been prescribed medication. And my advice on that is, should a Christian take medication? Yeah, I take medication. It doesn't happen to be for my mental health, but, I take an omega-3. That's supposed to make your brain smarter. But other than that, I have a stomach condition, and I take medication for that every morning. And I don't see that as a problem. Carey Nieuwhof addresses that very explicitly in his series and book called Overwhelmed, and I did an interview with him a couple months ago where he talked about the fact that it probably was a lifesaver for him, that's something he encourages. And so I think the other side of that is that, there are different things that as I've prepared for this series at our church, I've talked to a couple of doctors as well, and chief of psychiatry at one of the local hospitals. And he said definitely you should have medication in some cases, not all cases. And there are some people who have episodic depression. It just comes and the loss or the underlying issue gets resolved. And then there's cases where it's, it's biological, or you'll have a better word for that, Tim, than I will. But where it's really a medical condition that needs to be treated in the same way that you would treat a broken arm or you would treat a stomach condition or something like that. So I think it can be very, very helpful for people who need medication to get medication. And the other thing I think is true is that if you don't medicate properly, like if this doesn't resolve or if you don't go on medication, you will probably self-medicate. And that could be through overwork, that could be through alcohol, that could be through porn, that could be through overeating, it could be through a variety of things. And, when the pain is deep, we tend to self-medicate. And there are Christian ways of self-medicating as well, largely through overeating or gossip or just character flaws that we kind of overlook in the church. And so I want to make sure that I'm not self-medicating, but if I needed medication for that condition, I would definitely embrace that.
Dr. Jennings, you went through earlier with such a graphic explanation of what happens in the brain when someone is depressed. Can you get through that without medication? What role does medication play?
That's a great question, and I want to first just validate what Carey said about people self-medicating. If they're not getting actual treatment, they will often self-medicate with, and generally the things people self-medicate with are making the condition worse, not making it better. The food, the alcohol, the drugs, the things like this, the sex, and pornography and other things that people will self-medicate with really worsen the condition. So if people are in a situation where they're turning to something like that, it's much better to go to a professional and get actual treatment that are going to be designed to resolve it rather than just try to temporize the way you're feeling in a moment with some mood-altering experience. But with that being said, for some people, medications are absolutely miraculous. I mean, they take a medicine and it just transforms their experience. For others, though, they go through medicine after medicine after medicine, and they just don't seem to find anything that really helps. And generally, medicines for depression are only about, when you combine all the different studies and everything together, 40% effective. 60% of the time, medicines don't work. And they also have quite a bit of side effects and other things associated with them. So medicines are not a panacea, even though some individuals really do great with them. But that's because when we talk about this depression, we're not talking about one single problem when we understand the multitude of different contributing factors. One person's depression might be because they've got untreated sleep apnea. And until you treat the sleep apnea, then medicine isn't really going to resolve that. Another person may have hypothyroidism, or they might have hypoestrogenism, or something like that, and they need a hormone replacement. Somebody else might be in a marriage where their husband regularly dominates, abuses, and controls them. And a medicine, while there may be a place to help them transiently, ultimately will fail if they're not having that relationship healed. Other people have chronic guilt or chronic resentment and unforgiveness, and this bitterness and resentment will actually contribute to physical changes in the brain and body that can lead to depression. So while medicines definitely have a place, I use medicines, I look more holistically than that, and I look at the various contributing factors in their life that are deviant, and I think this way: how has God constructed and designed life to be the healthiest, and where is this person out of harmony with that design? And that's physical, psychological, relational, and spiritual. And we look at those areas and move them back more closely to the way God has constructed things to operate. Healing is the automatic result, and people get well.
Wow, excellent. So what we're saying is medicine is certainly one of the ways it does it. But what you're saying is, I think what you're saying is, when you get at the root of maybe the issue, maybe a thinking thing or an unforgiveness thing, that getting that right will reverse some of the things that are going on.
Yeah, and let me throw this out too. There's a certain concept in modern America, both from physicians and often from patients, where there's this idea: I can live my life any way I want. Doesn't matter how God's constructed things to do. And when I get sick, I'll just go to the doctor and take a pill. I can eat Big Macs and fries. I can drink milkshakes every day of the week. And when my cholesterol gets high, I'll just go take a cholesterol pill. And I'll take a hypoglycemic pill. I'll take this pill. I'll take that pill. Rather than actually saying, wait a second, those things I'm doing are actually damaging the spirit temple, and I actually need to make choices that are healthy, because the healthier our spirit temple, the more resilient the brain, and the more useful we are in fulfilling God's purposes. The more we damage the spirit temple, the more we need to be physiologically treated, then the less we're able to fulfill God's purposes in our lives. So there's a place for that balance there as well. But there's this mindset, and when it comes to mental health problems too, people often think, well, I'll just take a pill. Pills have a place, but pills do not resolve the contributing factors that ultimately get people well. I don't hear Greg.
I am. There we go. Yeah. There we go. Shawn, is somebody muting me, or is it just automatically happening? Do you know? Whatever.
Sorry, that would be me muting you. I'm sorry. You're getting some feedback when people are talking, so I'm muting you in between.
What's happening is I'm getting all kinds of happy birthday texts that are dinging. So So anyway, whatever. So so when there's when you're in a dark place, just a little bit of light gives hope. It really helps. And what can we do in the church that can offer hope and light to those who are suffering from mental illness? Carey, you're obviously in a series right now.
Yeah, we are. And I think
what can we do?
Yeah, breaking the silence is really important, and to remove the stigma, even being able to have the conversation, I think is important. And I think pastors, leaders who are willing to be vulnerable really, really helps. It's one thing to profile somebody else, and I think that's important. It definitely has a role. But I think to the extent that you're willing to be authentic, you're willing to be transparent, and you're willing to talk about it. And not every pastor's been depressed, not every pastor's been, in a place where they're in the ditch or burnt out or whatever. But to the extent that you struggle with discouragement, to the extent that you talk about having bad days and even bad seasons, I think that gives people permission to feel like, oh, this is normal, and I can be a Christian and I can still struggle. But there's also hope too, and so that's tough. It's hard, but I think authentic is the new cool. And as much as Cool Church is has a role, and having lights and sound and ways to attract people is kind of cool, I think when you're looking at under 30s, when you're looking at millennials, authentic speaks louder than anything. And when they see, that you are struggling and you have issues, and there are days where you might be reading your Bible, but you feel like it's just, bricks, there's no connection with God, they can relate to that because they feel that way. And yeah, that's not saying everything's negative. I mean, you're still pointing to the hope that you've experienced personally in Christ, and the hope that you've found. I also really resonate with what Tim said about professional help. We actually just handed out on Sunday, again, because I spoke on this, a card with 5 Christian counselors in our area, because a lot of people just don't know, who would I turn to? And I completely agree that there are counselors who are great and counselors who are not so great, and you need that fusion of biblical and clinical soundness. You phrased it better than that. And then the other thing I think that is really, really important is just community. I mean, we've talked about small groups in the church for years and years and years, but I'm a firm believer in small groups. And I remember I started in very small churches here where I live, and the big fear as we pushed past 200 people and then 500 and then beyond that was, well, who's going to do our pastoral care? First of all, I was terrible at doing pastoral care to begin with. Secondly, it just doesn't scale for the pastor to do pastoral care. And I've always said, I think 90% of pastoral care is just having someone to listen. And you don't have to be an expert. And most of the issues that people are struggling with in life, if they're dealt with in the context of a loving biblical community, that is small group, I think people who are in community definitely are healthier, and a lot of those issues can get resolved, and you might even do some avoidance in terms of avoiding people sliding into depression because they're actually processing their issues in real time in an authentic, transparent environment. And then when the need of the person exceeds the need of the group to meet that, you've got a bevy of counselors standing by who are able to help and to pull out their toolkit for which they have specialized training, and they can help with that. So I think those are a few ways that you can really help address the stigma and the issue.
Dr. Jennings, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in and say, what I addressed in my book, The God-Shaped Brain, was the power of belief. And one of the things that churches can do is help destigmatize beliefs that are actually harmful to people to hold. Like, if I have depression, it means I don't have enough faith. Okay? Beliefs like this that are actually quite damaging. And one of the things I help people realize, once they understand that depression or bipolar disorder or some of these things are physical problems with our biology, is that the Lord promises us new hearts and right spirits here on the earth, being reborn in the inner man. We aren't promised new biology until the second coming. Okay?
Wow.
Okay, and when people realize that, hey, a person with depression can still be honest, can still be truthful, can still be loyal, can still be faithful, can still be kind and gracious and so forth, even though they're depressed. And people without depression can be proud, arrogant, self-centered, exploitive, deceitful. See, when it comes to Christ, it's about becoming like Him in heart and mind and trusting Him. And you can have that and still have a mental health problem, because mental health problems are sometimes biological. Now, it is true that a mental health problem can be caused by an unresolved spiritual problem, like a sin in one's life that one's perpetually doing and not repenting of, but it would be a mistake to conclude that mental health problems are always a result of that. And that's the problem, because there are an occasion you can find somebody whose mental health problem is some unresolved sin that they won't repent of and won't get rid of, and then when they do, they actually find peace to their soul and the mental health problem goes away, that people will then globalize that and then say, well, everybody else in the church who hasn't gotten peace or is still struggling must have a spiritual problem. That is an error. So helping people understand that what we can have now is we can have a pure heart, a new heart, right spirit, but we don't get new biology until the second coming, is a real relief to a lot of people, because a lot of people feel guilty that they have bad genes or bad DNA or bad neurobiology that makes them vulnerable to depression or other mental health problems, like bipolar.
That's a powerful statement. We're promised a new heart, but we're not promised a new biology until heaven. So I'll have a full head of hair, and I'll stand about.
And we won't need glasses.
We won't need glasses. It'll all be good. Yeah, that's great. What about? And you kind of hit on it just a little bit, but are there 2 or 3 things that you see going on in the church that concerns you, dealing with depression and anxiety? Is there anything there?
Yeah, anything. I think the biggest factor in Christianity that contributes is imperialistic, authoritarian, dictator God constructs that keep people under a fear-ridden religious experience where they cower and live in fear. Oh, I hope I haven't forgot to confess this sin. Oh, I just forgot that. Oh, and they live in a kind of an oppressive religious experience rather than in a freedom and the love relationship that one is supposed to have with Jesus Christ and His Father.
Yeah, we're most of our listeners know that part of what I do is I'm the president of the ARC, the Association of Related Churches, and our mantra is we want to plant life-giving churches in every community in the world, really. And part of a life-giving church is recognizing a life-giving God, a life-giving Father. Jesus is life-giving, and I think what you're talking about is life-giving rather than life-draining.
Exactly. The Proverbs, it says, "He who pursues love finds life."
That's good. That's good. And as a pastor, I mean, do you think that highly authoritarian pastors contribute to the problem?
Me? Oh yeah, for sure. And I think I hopefully I wasn't that highly authoritarian, mind control pastor, but I've definitely seen that paradigm, and there's an awful lot of freedom, I think, that we don't explore in the church. And there's also, I think, the other enemy you had asked earlier about what other enemies are there, or what are some things we're doing that are mistakes. I mean, I just think churches confuse activity with faithfulness. That if you have a building, we're moving into a building, that it's got to be open 7 nights a week to be good stewards of it. Well, how can you actually be a family if you're at church 7 nights a week? How can you actually have any Sabbath if you're at church 7 nights a week? Like, how does that work? And so I think we have to look at a few activities, a few disciplines, a few things that really produce disproportionate results and give people space and margin and breathing room in their life. And the church is sometimes the enemy of that, not the friend of that. And I think that produces burnout in people and kind of that mind control you were talking about. And I think authenticity is the other thing. We put on our church faces and we pretend everything is great when it's not. And how do you foster an authentic dialogue? And I think it starts at the top, but it doesn't end at the top. Like, if you're not willing to go there as a pastor, I don't think your people are going to be willing to go there in any kind of public way. But if you're willing to go there, that's great. But then where are other people going to go? And is that the role of community and the role of like authentic discussion in groups and so on? So I think the more honest and the more transparent we are, the healthier the church will be.
So if there is a pastor or a staff member or maybe a spouse of one that's dealing with these issues that we're talking about, dealing with depression, intense discouragement, what should they do? How can they get help? And what can they tell their church? What would you recommend, Dr. Jennings?
Well, the first thing, if it has gone on for more than 2 weeks, if it's sometimes people are discouraged, and as a psychiatrist, I don't hear discouragement as depression. Depression is a much more global thing that actually causes physiological brain and body changes. So if it's been going on and persistent for more than 2 weeks, it's interfering with functioning. Energy is off, concentration's off, can't get the things done that what normally gets done, sleep is disturbed, appetite is disturbed, a real change in global functioning, then I would tell them they need to get a good medical evaluation by a psychiatrist, start with a primary care doctor maybe, make sure they don't have hypothyroidism, make sure they don't have untreated sleep apnea, because any of those physiological things are undermining resilience so that the stressors maybe they handled for years now are suddenly tipping them over the balance because their resilience is dropping off. We want to make sure, and if they come to see me, I assess their nutritional status. I want to make sure they're getting the nutrients that the brain needs to stay healthy. Make sure they're getting the rest, both the sleep and the physiologic rest. Exercise I didn't mention earlier. When we exercise regularly, multiple different brain proteins that keep the brain healthy are produced, mood elevators are produced, and anti-inflammatories are produced by your muscles that actually reduce the inflammatory stress on your brain and body. So it's very antidepressant to exercise regularly. So I evaluate the person as a What happened? Can you hear me, Carey?
I can, yeah. Did we lose Greg, I guess?
Lost the feed. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, that's strange. Man, what you said was so helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. I don't know where it got cut off, so.
I don't either. I was checking the rest, and